Good evening. We will call the March 18th, 2019 meeting of the Auburn Transportation Benefit District to order. And Teresa, will you please call roll?
Board Member Baggett.
Present.
Board Member Brown.
Here.
Board Member DeCoursey.
Here.
Board Member Holman.
Here.
Board Member Trout Manuel.
Here.
Board Member Wales.
Here.
Thank you. All right, we will move on to the consent agenda. All matters listed on the consent agenda are considered. Oh, did you call Board Member Pelosa?
Excuse me, sorry. Board
I'm
Member
here.
Pelosa.
I'm here.
Okay,
Thanks, Claude, because I thought maybe I messed up.
You know, you can't hear.
okay. All matters listed on the consent agenda are considered by the City Council to be routine, or this would be by the Transportation Benefit District Board, to be routine and will be enacted by one motion in the form listed. And on the consent agenda this evening are the minutes of the March 5th, 2018 Transportation Benefit District meeting. Do we have a motion? Board Member Holman.
Yes, I move to approve the March 5th, 2018 Transportation Benefit District minutes.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Board Member Wales.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Board Member Holman, did you want to say anything about the motion?
No.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Hearing none, all those in favor of the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, please say no. Passes. All right, next we will have action, the benefit district options. Shelley, are you doing a presentation on this, or is there?
Yes, I have a PowerPoint
Okay.
presentation. You want me up there now?
Please.
Okay.
Where's my full screen? There it is. Okay. I thought I would review with the board this evening the revenue options provided by the legislation, the Transportation Benefit District. There has been discussion about whether to assume by the city, the district, or let it stay out there as its own entity, and what steps to dissolve the TBD. The revenue options are as noted here. There's the well-known car tab fees. The $20 would generate about $900,000. $20 can be levied via council or board, via the board. After 24 months, the board could levy another $20, and after another 24 months, the board could levy another $10, up to a total of $50. Then there can be a one-year excess levy, and the excess levy would be going out and saying, the board saying, we want to levy $1 million, or we want to levy $5 million. And it'd be a one-time levy, it'd be levied, and that was it, 1 year. Then there's a sales tax option, which can be levied up to 0.2% of the sales tax. That would generate about $4,200,000 in the city based upon our existing sales tax base. And there's also general obligation bonds that can be either board authorized, similar to a councilmanic bond, or voted. And there's a total voted capacity of 5% of the assessed value of the district, and that would be $570 million. The board authority for bonds is 1.5%, and that would be $171 million. And the 1.5% is part of the 5%, so it's not in addition to the $570 million. It's included in the $570 million. Other revenue options that are under the legislation that would not be so practical for the city of Auburn. One would be commercial construction fees. However, if there are commercial construction fees, then they are similar to a transportation impact fee, which the city already levies, and that would be in lieu of the transportation impact fee. So it would just be replacing existing impact fee. And of course, there's road tolls, and I don't know if we want to set up a tolling booth here in the city of Auburn on maybe on Auburn Way. We can have a tolling booth. That might not work so well. I think you get a lot of emails now. So this is a schedule, just summarizing. You've seen this before. It summarizes those revenue options. Now, to assume or not to assume, what does that mean? Assumption of the TBD by the city. In 2015, the legislature changed the law where TBD may be absorbed by a city as long as the boundaries are congruent or the same boundaries. I don't think congruent's the right word there, but the city would then assume all the TBD's rights, powers, functions, obligations, so have all the revenue options available as the TBD, and would have all the liabilities and would do the projects that the TBD has outlined that are in the scope. It would cease to exist as a separate entity. And currently, as a separate entity, if there's any activity in this TBD, like there are some taxes or fees levied to support projects, then the city must prepare a budget, a separate budget, and also a separate financial report, which must be audited by the state auditor's office. And as of December of last year, about 3/4 of the TBDs have been assumed by their cities. So to assume, there's some steps here that we need to pass a resolution or an ordinance indicating the intention to hold a public hearing and propose the assumption of the rights and the powers, functions, and obligations of the TBD, and setting a time and a place for the hearing. And then after the hearing, the authority would then vote that it's in the public interest to assume the TBD. It'll pass an ordinance or resolution assuming the rights and powers and functions of the TBD. An annual financial report is required for the final year of existence, but however, for the city of Auburn, since there has been no activity or revenues or expenditures, that would probably, at this point, if it were to happen like right now, we went through these motions, there would not be a final report because there's nothing to report. Here's the pro and con analysis in my mind and what I thought of. And the big thing for finance would be we no longer need to have a separate entity, that we would require a separate financial report. Even now with no activity, we need to send something off to the state auditor's office filling out a form saying there was no activity and there's nothing to audit. And the revenue options remain, and the TBD may use any of the city's unused debt capacity under its bonding or debt authority. And the con would be you lose that 5%, and I think it was like 5.4 million or something, 570 million of bonding capacity. So you wouldn't have that available. But when I look at the TBD under the city, currently there is about 54 million of outstanding debt. Our total limit is about 285 million. So that leaves a councilmatic authority of 117 million, a voted authority about 114 million. So if there was a thought that this board would want to go out and issue bonds, voted bonds, or issue bonds for some sort of project, and it was going to exceed a major portion of the councilmatic capacity, then maybe you wouldn't want to assume the district into the city. Now, dissolution of a TBD, there are a few things that would dissolve it, and one would be that when the projects that are identified in the TBD, that within 30 days of its operations, or 30 days of those projects' completion, a TBD must end the operations. And it may continue to collect revenue to service debt on a project. So if there was bonds that were issued and the board was levying annually through the property tax system money to pay for those bonds every year, then revenues would still be collected to service the debt on those bonds until it's paid off. And then it has to be completely dissolved within 30 days after the financing is paid off. And the dissolution is by ordinance. So any questions? That's a little refresher for you.
Board members have any questions? Board Member DeCoursey?
So, Shelley, first question for you. When you talk about the pros of revenue options remaining, is that all the options that are listed under the TBD or just certain ones?
All of them.
All of them, okay. If I may follow up, I don't recall, maybe Ingrid could help. What is our projected unmet need for our projects currently that we had last year? We talked about it.
So the current 6-year tip that the city has about 200 million in projects identified for both local streets and arterial collector streets. So that's preservation as well as new capacity, signal, that's everything. TBD funds can only be used to fund arterial and collector type roadways. So we have about 70% of that 200 million is not secured funding.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Board Member?
So can you further elucidate around the losing the 5% bond capacity? Thank you.
Okay, let me go. All right, the 5%, the TBD as a standalone has its own debt capacity. And it's up to 5% of the assessed value of the boundary of the TBD, which is the boundary of the city limits. And based upon 2018 assessed value, it would be the 570 million. If the TBD is absorbed by the city, under the city, it would have to use the city's debt capacity. That 570 million would go away. Of that 570 million, about 171 million is boardmanic. Well, yeah, it's the board, or yeah, it'd be up to the board. It would not need to be voted, but I would have to advise the board that if we issue the debt, this is debt paid by property tax, and it's, if the council doesn't go out for a voted, or the board doesn't go out for a voted issue, then there has to be a revenue stream somewhere to service the debt, which would be one of the other revenue sources other than property tax. And under the city then, the council would have to use the city's debt capacity, which is, okay, for the city, this 2.5% is for general purposes, transportation. There are additional 2.5% for utilities. There's also another 2.5% for parks, and those would have to all be voted. So I haven't included those, but if there's going to be something voted for parks or something voted for utilities, then that does not fall into this 2.5%. So there's really 7.5%, but not very many cities use those. Generally, they have a utility system that's user fee-based, and parks, that if the city was going to do something with parks and wanted to go out for voted, they could use that 7.5 or that 2.5% into that. So this is general government, be like for buildings and streets, public works type of things. So we'd be the council for the street purposes, arterial and collectors, would be limited for council manic capacity to that 117 million, or an additional 114 million if it was voted. And again, under the council manic capacity, there should be a revenue stream that's identified for that debt.
Other questions from the board? Board Member DeCoursey?
Shelley, on the general obligation bonds, whether it's councilmanic or voted approved or voter issued, is there any difference in the term on the bonds, and what are those terms, and what is our interest and liability on that?
Okay, under the city, there's no limit on the term of the bond. However, under a TBD, there is a 25-year limit.
Board Member Pelosi, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did, Mayor. Thank you. You know, reading all this stuff, when you don't work with it daily, it's very confusing. And I'm going to admit that. Now, in the TBD dissolution,
Okay.
page 17. Now, we've been a board since 2011. And we haven't done anything to generate any activity.
Correct.
So I guess my question is, how long do we maintain this board position when we're not doing anything?
Well, that's why that's why that was brought to the board for your discussion of whether you dissolve in total, whether you dissolve and move it to a city function, or you maintain it and take action within the Transportation Benefit District Board.
Looking at page 19, are you going to show that, or?
Oh, I don't have that.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't have an electronic file of that.
19 is the MRSC.
Yes.
19
I don't have an
through
electronic
21.
file of that.
I noticed that the city of Kent, city of Renton, they're not they're not a transportation board. They're not on this list anyway.
No.
So, do you have any insight why they are, why they're not?
I don't.
Okay.
I do know that both the city of Kent did a B&O tax several years ago for streets, and it was dedicated for streets several years ago. And I don't know if you recall that. It might have been about 5 years ago. Yeah, and the revenues from the B&O were earmarked for street projects. And the city of Renton, I don't know what they're using. I do know that they do have a B&O tax. I don't know if they're using any of that towards their street projects.
Board Member Trout-Manuel.
So when I was at
Microphone.
When I was at DC, I went to several workshops and I heard the word tiger bonds several times. Is there, could we look for those bonds? There's money available, and could those be used?
So are you talking about the federal Tiger Grant program?
Yes.
So a Tiger Grant is typically required for much larger projects. So what you typically see funded there are state interchanges, and you're looking at anywhere from $20 to $100 million projects, specific single entity projects. So it's difficult for a city our size to have a project that will qualify for a Tiger Grant and compete with the other projects that get submitted to the federal government for that.
Okay. Thank you for clearing that up.
Board Member DeCoursey.
Thank you, Chair. When I went through this, I guess I was somewhat surprised and I guess maybe somewhat pleased when I saw that 3/4 of the city of the TBDs have been assumed by their cities. So it's absorbed into the city, so which we are talking about tonight. And also I look at the capacity under the city and the revenue options under the city, which still make a whole lot of sense, and it still gives us a fairly decent revenue capacity going forward as a TBD under the city. And I guess part of what I would state is that for putting the additional burden, although it's not a huge burden on staff or creating extra financial statements, and as Board Member Pelosi stated, that since 2011, we haven't done a whole lot. We've had some discussions, but that's about it. And to me, it makes a whole lot of sense to look at the possibility of doing an assumption into the city under a resolution or ordinance. And the other thing I have difficulty with, and also my past life, was when you have and it's not by the state naturally, but when you have a board, it's the same as the council same as a board. And it's okay, but it's we're in a dual capacity here, and that kind of makes it a little bit challenging. And I think perhaps maybe our residents might look at that and say, well, you guys are the same people, you got to take one hat off, put the other hat on. I'd rather keep one hat and look at this thing as a council process as this council goes through for now and future years, and give us that opportunity to look at the options that you've stated under the TBD under the city and dissolve the TBD.
Thank you. Other Board Member Holman.
Thank you, Board Chair. I've always been in favor of keeping the TBD, even though we haven't chosen to use it to this point, just simply because of the extra bonding capacity it gives us if we choose to use it at some time in the future. If we were to make a large transportation, say a flyover bridge up to Lee Hill, that would exceed the city's bonding capacity. We might have to use the bonding capacity of a TBD. It also gives us some additional financing options that we've chosen not to use up to this point. Keeping the TBD and its available options open costs us next to nothing. One meeting a year, pass the minutes, and yet we still have it there in our pocket to use if the necessity arises.
Shelley, I have a question, and it might be more Steve, but if the board were to determine dissolution into the city council, would there ever be an option then to reverse that or go back to having a TBD?
Probably.
The statute's not completely clear, but you would just go through the formation process again.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions? No. All right. Thank you, Shelley, very much.
Mayor?
That's your TBD primer.
Mayor, can
TBD
I add
primer.
one comment?
Yes.
Thank you. So on the comment about keeping the TBD but not enacting any of the funding options, so I do want to let the council know that under the grant processes, it is becoming more and more of a consistent question that we're getting about whether we have utilized all of our funding options that are available to us. And so in the future, having a TBD that we haven't actually made use of the funding options that are available in there may hurt us in some of those grant applications. It's not there yet, but I hear the rumblings coming, and so I'm expecting that in future grant rounds that will become an issue.
But Ingrid, could that also be said regardless of whether it's in a TBD or if it had been dissolved into the city?
If it is brought into the city or if it stays as a separate TBD, you're right, that same issue regardless. If it's fully dissolved and goes away, then that becomes less of an issue, other than it's still an option that's out there. And so how those grant agencies will look at that, we don't know. Again, this is questions that are coming, but they're starting to ask that with applications as to what are the other funding options that we have used in order to try to fund our projects before going after grant funds.
Great, thank you. All right. Any other questions or comments for Ingrid? All right, we will move on then to resolutions. We have one resolution this evening. Mr. Board Attorney, how about that? I mean,
Resolution number 2019-01. A resolution of the Auburn Transportation Benefit District adopting the 2018 annual
microphone,
report.
please.
hear me. Resolution number 2019-01, a resolution of the Auburn Transportation Benefit District adopting the 2018 annual report.
Thank you. Do we have a motion? Board Member Wales.
President of the board, Backus. I can't get everything right. Okay. President of the board, Backus, I would like to make a motion that we approve resolution number 2019-01.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Board Member Trout Manuel.
I second that, Mayor.
Thank you. Board Member Wales? Yeah.
Again, someone else on the board has alluded to, we haven't really done anything in the last, since 2011, so there's no change, and it's just a report saying no action, so it speaks for itself.
All right. Are there any questions or comments? Hearing none, all those in favor of Resolution 2019-01, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, please say no. Passes. All right. We have no more items on the agenda, so we are adjourned.